change. Do ideas matter? Himanshu Jha is an associate professor at the School of Liberal Studies, UPES, India. Mr. Himanshu works in the field of political science and political policy. Before UPES, he taught in the Department of Political Science at the South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, Germany. Himanshu is now a personal member of the SAI. He holds a PhD from the National University of Singapore, where he held the prestigious President Fellowship. Himanshu's research primarily focuses on institutional and policy change, public policy, governance, and development politics of accountability, state capacity, and bureaucratic rationality. Himanshu's most recent book, titled Capturing Institutional Change, The Case of the Right to Information Act in India, Oxford University Press, explores the why, how, and what of institutional change using a historical institutional lens. Himanshu has published widely in academic journals, edited books, and contributed his views to the popular media. Before his academic engagement, he worked in the development sector in India, where he focused on blending academic, socially relevant, and action-based research with active advocacy at various policy levels. We are very happy to have you, Dr. Himanshu Jha, amongst us. We heartily welcome you. I welcome you on behalf of myself, my colleagues of the Department of Political Science here, and all my research scholars, and also the postgraduate students. And now I would request you to deliver your lecture. Thank you so much. And over to Dr. Himanshu Jha.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I'm thankful to Professor Rao and Professor Priyanka Jha and the faculty and the students of BHU to have invited me for the 29th Manoranjan Jha Memorial Lecture. It is indeed an honor to be speaking on this occasion. Now, without further ado, sometime back I had given this talk at BHU as well, which was called Kashi Samvad, and some of the things that I'm going to say today is going to be a repeat of what I had shared on that platform. But I'm going to elaborate on a few of the things that I had missed out in the previous Kashi Samvad. And so without any further introduction, I would just straight away jump into my lecture, which is called Capturing Institutional Change and Do Ideas Matter? Now, most of the literature on political science actually looks at especially in South Asia, and the area studies political science is actually looking at some of the very, very serious issues, but not from the point of view of ideas. So there's a whole body of literature on clientelism, patronage democracy, that the state is captured by this dominant coalition of vested interests. But what this research does is it kind of bring the ideas back into political science and the political science causality. It also takes the processes within the state very seriously. It kind of goes back to Theda Skocpol's bringing the state back in, but it is not only about bringing the state back in, it is also about bringing the state and the ideas back in. And so today's talk would be largely engaging with the role of ideas, the consequential role of ideas in affecting institutional change. But before I do that, some of the definitional, I would like to kind of attend to some of the definitional terrain. What do we mean by institutions? And so to derive the definition of institutions, I kind of go back to the classic definition of institutions given by Douglas North, which is institutions are formal, informal rules of the game, formal, informal norms. And this is what institutions are. Institutions are formal and informal rules of the game that undergird organizations. And so institutions also have a bad habit of persisting on the historical landscape because history matters, and institutions are path dependent on, path dependent on history. And so it is very hard to exit from the, once the institutions take root, it is very hard to exit from that status quo. Institutions persist. Once they take root, they persist on the historical landscape for a long period of time. Institutional persistence also causes what is called a self-enforcing loop of externalities. Previous institutional choices results in the formation of vast social and political network, which take root with the institutions as well, because they have vested interests in the institutional persistence. And that's why it is very hard to exit from the status quo. It is very hard for institutional path to change. And so, when the institutional path changes, it poses a puzzle for social scientists, right? Because it is very hard for the institutional path to change. And there's a vast body, as a result, there's a vast body of literature which has recently emerged in the political science, which talks about, how institutions change and why do institutions change. So there's Peter Hall's work on why Great Britain, how and why Great Britain moved from the Keynesian policy to the monetarist policy during the Thatcher years. Or there's this phenomenal work, wonderful work by Kathleen Thelen, where she talks about the move from the anti-labor systems to the more labor-friendly systems in Western Europe, in large metalworking firms, in large metalworking organizations or industries in all across Europe, or closer home. People have tried to understand the 1991 economic reforms, which were, again, a kind of a valid case of institutional change. So as a result, what has happened is there's a vast body of literature on institutional change, and what they do is that they actually go back to history to explain an outcome, right? What is popularly now known as historical institutionalism. It's a wide field now, where small interlinked events or sequences spread across the timeline are seen as causalities, interlinked causalities, which lead to a bigger outcome. Most of this literature is focused on Western Europe, United States, but also on Latin America. But there are very few narratives or very few accounts of historical institutionalism in South Asia and in India. But there's another issue about historical institutionalism is that, when they explain institutional change, when they explain that the institutional path changes, they're trying to explain both the persistence and the change. But what they're also doing is they're actually identifying critical junctures in history. By critical juncture, they mean is that, there's a fork in the road, that the road kind of bifurcates in two directions. And the choice that a particular state or the choice that a particular system takes, or, which road to take, depends on a lot of social and political factors and the events that are contingent or interrelated with each other over time. Most of these accounts also are materialistic accounts or materialistic explanations. They kind of engage with the material conditions to explain institutional change. This body of literature has also ignored the role of ideas, right? And so the research that I'm going to talk about today is engaging very seriously with ideas and the role of the state. And the case of institutional change that I have selected for this research is the Right to Information Act. Simply because Right to Information Act, according to me, is a valid case of institutional change. And I'm going to get to it in a bit. I'm going to explain why it's a valid case of institutional change. But before I get into that, I want to flag this issue that the information regime in India was also characterized by the same kind of persistence and change that I was just describing, right? So for a long period of time, the norm of secrecy, the Indian state was governed by the norm of secrecy, right? People's right to know was actually something which was not supported by the legal regime. And so, starting from the 1947 onwards, or early 1950s, you had Official Secrets Act of 1923, which was just essentially merely amended to remove the references to Great Britain and just replace it with India, and we just adopted it as it is. And essentially what that mean was that receiving and giving out information from the state was a public offense, was a legal offense. Official Secrets Act was accompanied by other acts, such as the sections 1, 2, 3 of the Indian Evidence Act, or the Manual and Office Procedures of India of 1964. Official Secrets Act was again amended in 1967 to even make it stronger. You had something like Manual of Department Security Instructions of 1966, according to which you classify or declassify documents in terms of their categorizations, whether they should be secret, top secret, confidential, and so on and so forth, which was again amended to an even stronger version in 1996, right? So the story of information regime, or the institutional change in the information regime in India, is also one of persistence. And there was indeed a vast network, a socio-political and bureaucratic network, which had vested interest in this institutional persistence, because not giving out information in the public domain is where most of the processes within the state were actually shielded from being in the public domain, and so it was one of persistence. But in 2005, what happened is that this norm of secrecy, which governed the Indian state, was replaced by a new norm, which was called the norm of openness. But 2005, according to me, is not a critical juncture. 2005, to me, is not what historical institutionalists call critical juncture, because I don't see it as a small interlinked sequences or events spread over across the timeline, which created 2005. It's more of an ideational argument that I'm giving. Now, why right to information should be treated as a case of institutional change? Number one, because going back to the definition that I was giving about the norms or the formal or informal rules of the game, right to information signifies a norm shift. So the norm of secrecy that governed the Indian state for more than 65 years was replaced by the norm of openness, right? So it signifies a norm shift. The second important factor that it should be treated as a case of institutional change is that, unlike the other rights-based regimes, like the education, right to information did not have a policy precursor, right? So Mahatma Gandhi, for example, Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act represents a policy continuity from the previous policy. So you had Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, even going back in the early 70s, you had Antodaya, you had employment guarantee scheme of Maharashtra. So there was a policy continuity which actually was continuing for a long, Indian state was experimenting with it. But right to information does not represent any policy continuity. If at all, it represents a policy departure, right? And the third reason is that right to information is, and so in the other rights-based regime, you see a kind of a marriage between the directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights, right? So Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act, you have a right to work, which is directive principles of state policy, plus fundamental right of Article 21, right to live, right? And this is how it has been interpreted, and that's how it becomes a right. In case of right to information, it is the fundamental right of, freedom of expression and speech, which itself has been interpreted by the courts and the state as inherently containing right to know. So it is both a fundamental right and a statutory right, law. And that's why I call, that's why I don't treat other rights-based regimes or other rights-based policies as a case of institutional change, but only right to information as a case of institutional change because of these three reasons. Right to information, and why I decided to treat this as a case of institutional change is that it poses a it poses a research puzzle. And the first puzzle is that why did the state decide to turn the page? Amending the Official Secrets Act in 1967, adopting the Official Secrets Act in 1951, supported by other legal regime, institution which was persisting since the colonial times, and then turned the page in 2005. Why did the state decide to do it? There's also kind of a ancillary puzzle to it, which is connected to the first puzzle, is that Indian state, is, if you look at Pranab Bardhan and Atul Kohli and, scholars like who have actually engaged with Indian states, the Indian state is often viewed as a state which is a captured state, a state which is, borrowing from Bardhan, a state which is captured by a nexus of vested interests or dominant coalition. And so why would the state decide to initiate changes in the legal regime, which would be used variously to highlight or expose the very nexus which is said to govern these institutions? As we know, RTI has been used extensively to expose, both petty and grand corruption, but also, what actually is happening within the state, right? RTI has been instrumental in doing that. And so why would the state decide to kind of expose itself to such scrutiny? So that is the research puzzle, and it's not as if that people have not written about it. People have tried to explain this puzzle, and there are 3 or 4 dominant narratives which explain, why right to information, why right to information came about. And the first most dominant narrative is the social movement narrative, that there was a social movement in rural Rajasthan starting from the early 90s and the late 80s around right to work, which then had a kind of a national character built into it, which was called National Campaign for People's Right to Information, NCPRI. That was consequential in putting pressure on the state, and the state yielded under that pressure, and right to information came about in 2005, of course, with the with the rights-friendly government at the helm. And that's the most popular narrative, and that's the narrative which still goes on, both in the academic and policy circles and also in the popular media. The second related narrative was that, right to information was also, using Bourdieu's symbolic capital. Right to information emerged from the power of eminent activists negotiating with the differently layered state. The third narrative was that, it was because of the role of interpersonal dense elite network. So this was in the third strand of work is in the tradition which emerged, London School of Economics, people like Stuart Corbridge, who see the role of elites or the elite network playing a consequential role in affecting institutional change or causing institutional change or causing any change, so to speak, within the state and causing shifts in the policy paradigms. And so the third popular narrative which emerged was that, no, this was not a social movement or eminent activists negotiating with the differently layered state. It was actually the role of the dense interpersonal elite network which caused this institutional change. And then there's a fourth popular narrative of political claim making about we did it, right? So, it is the party which was in power in 2005, which actually claimed that it was because of our pro-rights-based agenda through National Advisory Council and through the Common Minimum Program that the right to information could see the light of the day. And so the fourth strand is a more non-academic strand where, there's a lot of political claim making around right to information. I question all these 4 strands, right? I problematize all these 4 strands simply because if you, and there's a methodological issue there, is that simply because if you if you kind of engage with the literature on historical institutionalism, you are inclined to kind of, redefine both the starting point and the point of departure, right? So when you redefine the starting point, both the starting point and the point of departure, that allows you to bring in new evidence, which kind of leads you to a different argument, which leads to you to a different conclusion. And why did why at all did I not start at early 1990s or early or late 80s? Is that because, for the norm of openness to emerge, it has to emerge from some space or some platform or some kind of a debate or churning which was happening within the state. And I feel that the norm of openness actually emerged from the norm of secrecy, which had taken root right since independence. So for me, both the starting point and the point of departure was actually 1947, when India attained independence, right? And that led me to a different conclusion, where I argue that right to information, the institutional change in the information regime in India, was a result of the endogenous ideas emerging from within the state right since independence. So it was neither social movements, not the four strands that I talk about. It was actually the consequential role of ideas. Of course, there was an ideational churning, and I would just talk about it when I would be describing some events or some empirical, when I would engage with the empirical material that I have with me. And so how do I conceptualize this? So this was neither a critical juncture. So this was not, 2005 was not a fork in the road where, the roads is bifurcating into two directions. And the state has this policy choice to either go for, persistence of norm of secrecy or choose a new kind of road, which is going in the other direction, right? This was not a critical juncture. 2005 was not a critical juncture, but I conceptualize it differently. Is that I call it something called, I use layered tipping point to explain this causality. And what is a tipping point? Tipping point is a slow moving process. It is not a critical juncture. It's not a point where, an exogenous pressure actually results in the alteration of, institutional path. Tipping point is a more gradual, slow moving process. And the tipping point can be characterized by, three, it has typically got three characteristics. First is that changes are slow moving and evolutionary in nature. The second is that by carefully tracing the institutional path, one should be able to delineate small interlinked changes. And the third is that these changes actually accumulate over time. It's not sudden, or it's not forced by some exogenous shock. It is actually an internal kind of endogenous movement, and they are evolutionary in nature. And this is what I mean by tipping point. And tipping point was also layered. So it is not as if it is a linear process. By layering, I mean that, new idea or a new norm emerges on top of the established old norm, which was the norm of secrecy, and new ideas on openness actually emerged right since independence, and eventually gained enough political power to displace the norm of secrecy, which was persisting since 1947. And that's why I call it layered tipping point. Just to give you an example, tipping point is like, it is like an earthquake model. So what seemed sudden in 2005 was actually the result of the tectonic plates shifting underneath the Earth's surface for a long period of time. So it is actually a long-drawn, slow-moving process, which seems sudden, but it's actually not sudden, right? And what are these layers that I'm talking about? I've kind of, this needs to be understood in two phases or two layers. My first layer starts in 1947. 1947 was the time when the norm of secrecy was in the process of getting entrenched within the state at all the systemic levels. This was the time when the state was actually going in the direction of adopting norm of secrecy. But I will just open the, excuse me, sorry. So the norm of secrecy was in the process of getting entrenched within the state. But at the same time, there were rudimentary or nascent ideas on openness which emerged from different sources or different segments from within the state, right? And so this was the period where you typically see, where you kind of see a kind of a tussle between the new or nascent rudimentary ideas on openness emerging from within the state and the norm of secrecy which had already taken root within the state, and I call it ideational churning because, there was a lot of churning which was happening within the state right since independence. And there were three sources of this churning. There were three sources of these ideas of openness which emerged during the first phase or during the first layer that I'm talking about. And the first source was the reports of the government committees. There were a number of committees which were constituted by the government of India since 1947, committees which looked at the public administration in India, committees which looked at the probity in public life, and so on and so forth. The ideas of openness actually emerged from these committees itself. So for instance, in 1956, the first appraisal of public administration took place, was undertaken by a famous US senator called Paul H. Appleby, who was invited by the then finance minister of India, C.D. Deshmukh, and Ford Foundation. And he wrote the first public administration appraisal. He did the first appraisal of public administration or the existing state of affairs of public administration in India. And so while touching upon range of issues, Appleby also touched upon the issue of prevailing culture of secrecy and observed, and I quote, "The new government has not yet got away from an arbitrary secrecy, unnecessarily depriving Indian university professors and citizens generally of desirable information." Likewise, the first report of the Press Commission of India in 1954 said that merely because a circular is marked secret or confidential, it should not attract the provisions of the Act, which is the Official Secrets Act, if the publication thereof is in the interest of the public and no question of national emergency and the interest of the state as such arises. And later reports throughout the 60s and the early 70s, like the Santhanam Committee report or the Law Commission of India government Law Commission report of 1947, or the C.D. Deshmukh report actually talked about the prevailing secrecy of government and that there is a need to amend the Official Secrets Act. And so these were the reports which actually expressed the initial ideas on openness, which challenged the prevailing secrecy in the government, essentially just challenging the norm, the norm of secrecy which had taken root within the Indian state. But what is interesting is that you can, even then in the formative years, in the layer one or the phase one that I'm talking about, you can see the ideational connections between different reports or different people. So for instance, Paul H. Appleby was invited by C.D. Deshmukh, and in 1968, when C.D. Deshmukh was the chairman of this committee, which looked at the working of the government machinery in India, he also expressed similar sentiments. So you can see an ideational connection. Or when Paul H. Appleby actually recommended the establishment of Organization and Methods Division within the Cabinet Secretariat and the institution and establishment of Indian Institute of Public Administration, these institutions also express similar sentiments or similar ideas on openness, right? So there was a kind of an ideational connection between these committees. So they were not like standalone sporadic expression of ideas of openness, but there was a kind of an interconnection, and there was an ideational milieu which was actually also emerging from what these reports were saying. The second important source were the courts, right? So a number of cases where the courts actually approached the Article 19(1)(a) from the point of view of freedom of expression and speech, and freedom of press, and they unanimously in most of these decisions they said that you cannot have freedom of expression and speech if you don't have right to know, or court did not frame it directly as right to know, but as you cannot have freedom of expression and speech if you don't have free flow of information, on dissemination of information in the public domain. And so the most famous case from the two most famous cases from the 1950s are the Ramesh Thapar case and the Brish Bhushan case, where the court actually upheld Article 19(1)(a) and struck down the privilege that the government claimed, behind Article 19(1)(a), which triggered the First Amendment, which was initiated by Jawaharlal Nehru, which essentially meant inserting an article or protective clause right before Article 19(1)(a) to give more powers to the executive to not give out information in the public domain. This kind of signifies the polarity of the state on one hand, but also kind of a churning which was taking place between the nested norm of secrecy and these ideas which emerged from the periphery. They were nascent ideas, rudimentary ideas, but significant nonetheless, because they challenged the prevailing norm of secrecy. And the third important source in this phase was the opposition itself. Opposition was very important because the exclusive privilege of access to official information was just extended to the ruling party. The opposition members did not have that access. And so, for instance, in 1965, there was a ruling by the Speaker of Lok Sabha. The Speaker at that time was Hukum Singh. And he ruled that, the members of the parliament, whether they are from the ruling party or the opposition party, can quote freely from the confidential documents from the state, from within the state. And this was triggered by an incident in Lok Sabha where P.K. Deo, who belonged to the Swatantrata Party, actually wanted to quote from the two union subcommittees report and the CBI report, which was rather damaging to the two former chief ministers of Odisha. And he was actually stopped from quoting from that or citing from that report or quoting from that report. And that created a furor in the parliament. And the pressure and the Speaker of Lok Sabha or the lower house was actually pressured to give that ruling where he said that even the opposition members can quote freely from the documents which were classified or confidential because these are the parliamentarians. And right after that 1965 rulings, there was a note which was circulated to all the departments and ministries saying that, perhaps it is time to amend the Official Secrets Act to make it even stronger. And in 1967, we all know that the Official Secrets Act was actually amended to an even stronger version, right? And so there was always this pushback from the state. Whenever these ideas on openness emerged from the fringes, there was always this pushback, and that's why I said there was a polarity of ideas within the state as well. So these were the nascent rudimentary ideas which emerged in the fringes. But what happens when the opposition comes to power after the emergency? Emergency essentially meant centralization of power, complete suspension of civil and human rights, of course, no freedom of expression and speech. And when opposition came to power in 1977, surely you see that these ideas which were on the periphery slowly start moving to the policy center stage. And so then Home Minister of the ruling party, Charan Singh, actually constituted a committee which to examine whether the Official Secrets Act should be amended and whether there should be some kind of an access to information law which allows the state or which allows the different departments and ministries to put information in the public domain. Of course, the members of that committee were representatives of the Ministry of Home, Cabinet Secretariat, Ministry of Finance. So they kind of concluded that there was no need to amend the Official Secrets Act. But nonetheless, this was the first time that a policy process or the policy step was taken by the ruling party to kind of examine some kind of a possibility to give access to information. Courts also sharpened their stance on Article 19(1)(a). So the famous Raj Narayan case, where he actually challenged the election of then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. We all know about that case, that challenge, that kind of claim that the election of Indira Gandhi was illegal because she used official wherewithal to win the elections. But an important side story to that case is that, the Rajnarayan's lawyers were actually looking for something called Blue Book. Blue Book actually records all the movements of the prime minister, and the state claimed privilege to it. But that Blue Book was essential to the case because, that would prove that Indira Gandhi had indeed, used her official, wherewithal to win the elections. And so the court actually rejected the privilege that the government claimed or the state claimed and upheld the demand from the Rajnarayan's lawyer. And actually, in the judgment, clearly said that this is citizens' right to know, and clearly framed their ruling as citizens' right to know in Article 19(1)(a) as inherently containing citizens' right to know. So Janata Party, during the Janata Party time, you clearly see that these nascent rudimentary ideas that I was talking about in the first phase actually were slowly moving to the policy center stage. And even when Janata Party lost elections, after 2 years, when the elections were called again, you see that these ideas on openness actually gained momentum. So you have reports by Indian Institute of Public Administration in 1981, 1982. You have a report by the Law Commission of India, where they're actually just not saying that there's Indian government should open up and challenge the Official Secrets Act, but they actually just directly demanded right to information or right to know, or citizens' right to know. You also have courts sharpening their stance. The SP Gupta the SP Gupta case, famously known as Judges Transfer case, also referred to the whole issue as citizens' right to know. The court also sharpened their stance, and you also see the ideational connection. And so, for instance, the court, in the SP Gupta case, Rajnarayan's case was cited verbatim. The findings of the IIPA report, the Indian Institute of Public Administration report of 1981 and 1982 were reproduced verbatim in the judgment. And so there were ideational connection as well. But there's another ideational connection from the Janata Party period, is that, this is for the first time in 1983 that a private member's bill on freedom of information was actually introduced by a member called G.C. Bhattacharya, who belonged to Lokdal, who belonged to the Lokdal party, which was part of the Janata Party. And so what was initiated by Janata Party actually finds a kind of a policy articulation in form of this private member's bill, which was called the Freedom of Information Bill, and which was later tabled by Subramaniam Swamy of Janata Party in 1984 in the lower house. And so there are ideational connections as well. And I think at a very rudimentary level, this private members bill has an uncanny resemblance to the present day RTI. And it finds no mention in the mainstream narratives that I was talking about, right? But in 1986, when Rajiv Gandhi government, again, the state strikes back, Rajiv Gandhi government amends something called the Commission of Inquiry Act, which allows the commissions to table their reports in the parliament. And so this was amended, where the commissions were actually empowered not to share their reports or table it in the parliament, right? And so there was always this churning which was happening in the first phase, or the layer one. But by the end of 1980s, these initial nascent ideas had gained enough political power within the state. They kind of taken root within the state thinking. And that is the layer two that I'm talking about, and I will quickly go through it. From 1989 onwards, you see these coalition governments coming to power. And when the National Front government comes to power in 1989, you see that from the opposition politics, or from the periphery, these ideas of openness have actually moved to the policy center stage, or mainstreaming of these ideas has occurred, right? So most of the political parties from 1989 onwards promise in their election manifesto some kind of access to information, or freedom of information, or right to information. They form or constitute committees. So for instance, VP Singh forms BS Lali Committee in 1989. I.K. Gujral constitutes a committee on, which is famously known as Shori Committee, which examined the possibility of, promulgating a right to information or freedom of information. The second thing which is happening is that within the state itself, there's an effort to build all the cabinet, all the ministries and the departments. After the Shori Committee, all the ministries and the departments get a copy of their Freedom of Information Bill to comment. There's Chief Minister's Conference, which kind of resolved or recommends some kind of freedom of information law. There's Chief Secretary's Conference, which actually deliberates on similar lines. So there's an effort to build the epistemic consensus as well. But courts as well are now actually framing it as a right to know. So you have these cases on probity of life, Dinesh Trivedi case, ADR case, where courts are framing Article 19(1)(a) as inherently containing right to know. And then there are subnational initiatives which are emerging as well. 9 states actually promulgated their own right to information laws starting from 1999 onwards, right? By the time NDA government comes to power in early 2000, the ideas of openness that I was talking about had gained enough political power and pace where it was very hard to actually ignore it. So NDA, the National Democratic Alliance, actually had promulgated its own Freedom of Information Act in 2003. And of course, 2004, the elections were called. And so it was notified, but it could not be implemented. And then it was again picked up by the UPA government. The ideas, the norm of openness had become so powerful that a ruling party which had ignored it for a long period of time could not ignore it any longer. And 2005, according to me, was a tipping point and not a critical juncture, because this has a kind of a longer genealogy of ideas emerging right since independence. And 2005, as we all know, Congress Party promulgated Right to Information Act. And there's an interesting thing that there's an interesting incident that I forgot to mention, is that when Narasimha Rao government came to power, following VP Singh government, there was kind of brief hiatus of activities around right to information. And so we would believe that, during the heyday of economic reforms, the government would be actually very open to the idea of transparency and accountability, which was also part of the structural adjustment program, but that did not happen. And they actually amended Manual of Department Security Instructions of 1966 to an even stronger version in 1994, right? So there was, till as late as 1994 or 96, they were resisting the idea of openness or the norm of openness. And in 2005, they could not ignore it any longer, right? So the ideas had gained enough political power. So then, and 2005 is the tipping point, according to me, right? But what about the social movement? And very quickly, should we ignore the social movement, or social movement did not have a role to play at all? I say no. Social movement does have a role to play, but had the state thinking not moved in a favorable direction over the years, they would have dealt with the same social actors very differently. I also problematize the whole social movement narrative because, because I again see the role of ideas in this whole epistemic network, which emerged from the 1990s onwards. And social movement was just part of this bigger universe that I was talking about. And so you had people, in this bigger universe, you had people from the legal fraternity, for instance, who were involved in the Janta Party, during the, involved in the PUDCLR, Public Union, I don't remember I cannot recall the full form. Now it is known as People's Union for Civil Liberties. You have people like P.V. Rajgopal or Ajit Bhattacharjee, who are actually running, Everyman's Weekly and Prajaniti for Jaiprakash Narayan. So, there is clearly a kind of an ideational linkage, which you can actually trace back to the Janta Party. You had people from, former bureaucrats who were part of this larger universe. So I kind of see it not as, and then there were social movement actors like, so, you know, Aruna Roy, Nikhil Dey, Shankar Singh, the usual, who were part of the normal narrative. And I don't see it as a social, and that's the reason I don't see it as a social movement, because social movement was part of this bigger universe, and I call it epistemic network. There's a fifth issue which I will quickly touch upon, and then I will finish because I've already taken so much of time, is that, you know, what about the role of global norms? Between 1990 and 2010, 76 countries have promulgated access to information. Remember, 1990s was also the time when structural adjustment programs were being initiated, and transparency and accountability was part of the conditionalities of structural adjustment programs. You know, so how do we locate the Indian case? Was Indian case unique after all? You know, was Indian case a result of endogenous process of you know, ideas emerging from within the state, or was there an exogenous pressure in 2005? I argue that there was a role of global norms, but they were contingent on what was happening at the domestic level. And I present two arguments. First was the norm demonstration, the demonstrative impact of norms which were actually emerging in other countries. So the supporters of these norms were always citing these examples when they would actually talk about or challenge the norm of secrecy which had taken root within the state, that, hey, there are established democracies in the world which are extending these rights to the citizens. We should too, as an established democracy. So there's a demonstrative impact of this norm. But as the state thinking moved in the direction of, you know, experimenting with these rights being extended to the citizens, and the, you know, norm of secrecy, or the idea of, norm of openness, or the idea of openness actually took root within the state. You know, from the demonstrative impact, the global norms also had an operative impact. So but operative impact, we were not like passive takers of these norms. These norms were actually calibrated in conjunction with what was happening at the domestic level. What Amitav Acharya calls norm localization. We localize these norms according to the needs. So for instance, in the releasing the file notings in the pre-decision period was actually dictated by Freedom of Information Law of US, or the inclusion of private bodies in right to information was actually South African law provided that template for that particular decision. So, you know, there were global best practices which were borrowed upon, but in conjunction with the local, discourse or endogenous discourse which was taking place. So what does this research tell us? Ideas matter, history matter. We need, to explain an outcome, we actually have to trace it back to the origin. And so that's why as political scientists, we need to take history very seriously. We need to engage very seriously with the ideas and the ideational churn, going beyond the interest-based arguments. And so that's something that this particular body of work is trying to tell. And I'm kind of extending this idea to, my emerging work around state capacity governance, explaining policy outcomes and policy paradigms. Thank you for listening to me, and sorry if I've gone too fast. I welcome any questions, comments, clarifications. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Himanshu, for this very, very fascinating and such a rich talk. I'm sure the students now have a better sense of, the emergence of this entire ideational exchanges that took place in making right to information and shaping of right to information. Somehow the larger discourse, which has been built around the social movement sort of contribution, and reading it solely from the lens of social movement sort of moment in shaping of right to information, will now find a lot of other stories that you just brought out so brilliantly. And on behalf of the department, I am so thankful and also elated. Finally, we got the opportunity to have you. And we would also have the opportunity soon, now that the COVID challenges are coming to a closure, hopefully, that we would also have the opportunity to hear you offline and in person. So before I ask my questions, if there's anyone who would like to ask a question or would like to write it, they could write the question in the chat box, or you could put a X in the cross in the chat box and ask your question yourself. Himanshu, I would also like to apologize right now because, we don't have a lot of students, but luckily we are recording because we have exams starting from next week. So, the COVID challenges have taken most of the universities affected all of us in the same manner. But we now have the 5th semester exams for which a lot of students are busy preparing, and the exams start on the 21st. But we do have the opportunity of having this lecture recorded. So if no one has a question, I have two questions.
No, Priyanka, no need to apologize because, I just talked about global norms, and by global norms, this is a good audience. This is a good number. Yeah.
Okay, because I was like, me and the head, we were discussing that we've invited Himanshu, and we will, it's so hard because most of our undergrad students are busy with exam and half of the department is busy with admission. We are also in the process of admitting the master students. So a lot of us, I got late because that duty just got over. But I have just two queries, Himanshu, two queries. The first query is, how would you like to sort of see right to information in the present scenario? Do you see it in terms of the weight it carried in 2005, in terms of the transformational sort of, impact that right to information had in really sort of strengthening the democratic ethos of Bharat? And how would you sort of read it right now? Because there are a lot of challenges that have emerged in terms of how responses are given to these queries. And it's not the second one is not a query, but I'm very grateful for you to bring out the role of ideas in shaping of massive sort of, what we call as acts, or, the aspect of the ideas, they tend to diminish. And thank you so much for voicing the role of history, the role of ideas, for an intellectual historian like me, who is very interested in mapping how ideas were emerging, how ideas were transformative. Now, saying that, in the larger sort of epistemic networks, global networks, how would you see the story of right to information in India? Would you read it organic? Would you read it differently? Or was it in conversation with other exchanges that were emerging around the same time in many post-colonial societies? So is there a point of reference for us to say that our movement actually talks to similar movements globally? Or would you sort of locate the peculiarity of this narrative? Thank you so much, Himanshu.
Thanks, Priyanka. As your questions are searching as ever, but I will try to address them one by one. The first about the challenges, of course, post 2005, the way RTI has actually the direction that right to information as a law has taken turn is at best we can call it glass half full, so to speak. So, there have been efforts to dilute the law, from the beginning, 2019 being the latest amendment to the law, where, the state have tried to blunt the bite that the law holds. The second issue is also the reluctance in implementing the law by the state information commissioners or the State Information Commission. The State Information Commission in many states is also in a disarray. State Information Commissioners are not appointed. Even if they're appointed, most of them are former bureaucrats. Why would they penalize their own genus, right? And so these are the problems of the law. But however, my argument is that, this is the case of institutional progression, in the sense that, from the days and from the era when getting any information from the states was a kind of a public offense, was not a public offense, a legal offense, to a state where now citizens have a legal right to information or seek information from the state is in itself an institutional change, right? Indeed, even despite this reluctance, despite this kind of dragging the feet by the state, citizens are still using right to information in big numbers. So between a very modest figure actually puts the figure at 30 million applications filed annually, and that does not include the state information commissions, right? And we have seen that I've done some field work in Bihar around how citizens use right to information, and there are indeed cases where each village has a right to information activist. And so in my view, how much the citizens use right to information is very important. How they engage with the right to information law is something which will give power to the law, right? Which would give, unless the state decides to countermand it completely, which is very difficult, because it is very difficult to countermand Right to Information Act, because Article 19(1)(a), it's a fundamental right. It's Article 19(1)(a), so it will be challenged in the court of law. So it has a mixed answer. I have a mixed answer to that, and that's the answer to the challenges part. And so the churning that I was talking about in my paper right now, there's a similar kind of churning which is taking place now on the ground. If you people who worked on right to information, or people who are working on right to information, and how it is behaving on the ground, actually all unanimously agree that there's another kind of churning or pushback which is taking place between the citizens who try to seek information and the state which is reluctant to part with information. So that is my answer. The second is about the role of ideas in history and how peculiar and unique India is in this situation, in this whole context. And I feel that at least in terms of discipline as a political science, we have actually moved away, over the years, from engaging with serious, with ideas or taking history very seriously by looking at, what Paul Peterson calls a snapshot view of history. And the view of history is not a snapshot view of history. It should be kind of number of frames interconnected over time, which Paul Peterson called politics in time, right? So we have to view history, that's why we need to take history very seriously, where we looked at politics in time and not have a snapshot view of politics, right? And so that's something that we have been not been engaging, sadly, in Indian academia, and we need to bring the role of ideas and history back in political science. In this particular case, and also in some other cases, and of course your work on Indian thinkers, I feel that these ideas also, there's an issue of endogenous and exogenous in this. So I feel that in this case, the endogenous ideas which actually emerge organically from within India have an important role to play. So for instance, in my first phase from 1947 onwards, these committees or the opposition members, the need to actually challenge the norm of secrecy emerged from local conditions or what was happening at the local level. They were not kind of expressed by looking at what was happening elsewhere. So it was more of an endogenous movement. It would be a critical juncture if it was exogenous. It's like a giving an example from natural sciences, like a meteor hitting the earth and dinosaurs going extinct, and that created a different evolutionary path, right? And so it's not like that. So it's more so, and that's why I place India as a unique, this is a unique moment where, endogenous ideas need to be taken very seriously. Not everything happened exogenously. That's my longish answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu, for your responses. Would anyone like Dr. Jha, any questions? Okay, then I would give the floor to our head, Professor Shubha Rao.
You need not, Priyanka, because I listened to the lecture throughout, and I admired Dr. Jha for his clarity and for his depth of understanding. Very pertinent questions you asked, and you explained the situation, the poverty of audience which we have right now, the reasons for that. And I also join you in my apologies. And yes, no doubt, I mean, it cannot be exaggerated. The quality of that lecture cannot be exaggerated. It was certainly very outstanding. And on behalf of the students and the department and all my colleagues, I now once again extend my heartfelt thanks and my gratitude to Dr. Himanshu. And we look forward to having his lecture, an offline lecture as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rao, and thank you, Professor Priyanka Jha. Thank you so much for having me here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.